Welcome to J Life with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Okay, well, today I'm speaking with Dr. Shira Klein, a professor in the history department at Chapman University. Shira's research is mostly surrounding Italian Jewish history, focusing really on everything from emancipation in the mid-1800s to the rise of fascism of the 1900s. But Dr. Klein's also recently written an article about Holocaust distortion on Wikipedia, and I'm excited to delve into both of these facets of her research here on the podcast. Dr. Klein, welcome to J Life with Daniel.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, so let's actually start with the second component of your research. You recently wrote an article that's titled Wikipedia's Intentional Distortion of the History of the Holocaust. And for listeners, I'll link this in the show notes. But I'm wondering if you can give a brief summary, sort of the abstract and what drew you to researching the way that people discuss and actually distort the Holocaust on Wikipedia.
Right. So I'm going to start with the second question first. How did I get into this? So I've been teaching my undergrad students for about 10 years now, or 11 years, to edit with Wikipedia, to edit Wikipedia. And basically what I have them do is find a really good secondary source, like a trustworthy peer-reviewed secondary source, then find an article that they're interested in working on in Wikipedia, and then use the secondary source to make that article better. And back in 2018, one of my students was doing exactly this assignment. His name is George, and he chose he wanted to write about post-war anti-Semitism in Poland, or just post-war Jewish life in Poland. And I told him, sure, take a look at Jan Gross's book, Fear, which I knew had come out with a really reputable press and had made lots of waves. And I knew that although there were sort of arguments about some of his findings, overall, I knew that this was very much accepted in the mainstream and sort of considered a great source. So I said, pick a chapter from that and find an article to edit. And that's exactly what he did. And one of the tasks that the students need to do is to go on the Wikipedia article's talk page. Every Wikipedia article has a talk page, which is where editors discuss the changes that they're thinking of making, and go and say, heads up, everyone, this is what I'd like to do to the article. And he did that. And like I said, all my students do it. And normally there's no response, or maybe there'll be an editor saying, yeah, good luck with this. This sounds good, or maybe a suggestion or two on minor changes. But in this case, there was this user who came on, an editor who came on and said, this is not a good source. And in fact, Jan Gross is not a reliable source. He just represents one side, and something along the lines of, and besides, Jews were to blame for post-war anti-Semitism because they were all communists. And I was like, wait, what? This sounds just completely fantastical. Mm-hmm. And again, I know for a fact that this source is a really reliable source. And what kind of an argument is that, speaking about 1946 Poland, saying Jews are to blame for anti-Semitism? So I sensed that something was off, and I kind of weighed in on that page, and then a whole bunch of other people weighed in, and by this point, George was probably regretting he had ever picked this assignment, or perhaps even done this class with me. And that was my first experience with what eventually turned out to be just the tip of the iceberg, because eventually I was to understand that there was a whole group of people like that editor, and that they're very active on Wikipedia, and they promote this kind of narrative. So what is this kind of narrative? Basically, what was our argument, or what did we find on Wikipedia? And I'll just say this isn't this isn't my work solo, right? My co-author, Dr. Jan Grabowski, and I worked on this in equal parts. And basically what we found was that through the efforts of this relatively small group of editors, and we're speaking about a dozen at most, more like half a dozen, Wikipedia articles came to have this narrative, which is very much in line with a Polish nationalist far-right narrative of history. So things like associating Jews with communism to a greater extent than they actually had associated with communism. Um, Sometimes it involved narratives about Jews as perpetrators in World War II. So showing Jews as perpetrating crimes against Poles. Sometimes it would be inflating the phenomenon of Jewish collaboration with the Axis powers or with the Nazis. So what might have been like a very tiny phenomenon of an outlier would suddenly be blown up on Wikipedia to show Jews as collaborators. And then also just here and there portraying Jews as obsessed with money or as kind of money hungry. Um, yeah. So these were all sorts of parts of this narrative that we found on Wikipedia, and it wasn't Holocaust denial, right? There was none of that. It was distortions. It was taking something like with a tiny grain of truth and then blowing it up into a big phenomenon. Yeah. So Jan Grabowski is one of the world experts on Polish history. So he worked on identifying false statements or exaggerated statements. And I, by this point, had become somewhat of an expert on Wikipedia. And so we joined forces and we worked on this for 2.5 years. We also interviewed editors, Wikipedia editors. And then, yeah, this was the result.
Wow, that's fascinating. And I'll just say, it's funny because in my lifetime, I remember middle school and high school Wikipedia being maligned as probably the least reliable source you can use. And then, especially when I was in grad school, things were starting to change where Wikipedia was starting to seem like one of the most reliable sources, and it's well footnoted. But I guess due to the crowdsourced nature of it, it does leave itself open to distortion. Is the thinking that this is a centralized effort by the Polish government, right, in the same way that they've tried to deny a lot of their own culpability in the Holocaust, or is this sort of more bottom up, just with a group of bad actors?
This was we found no evidence of of any government involvement. So if there is any, we don't know about it. This seems to us, at least from the evidence that we have, to be like you say, a grassroots bottom-up initiative of several individuals who are very driven and very committed. And we were very careful in our research or in our write-up not to reflect on the motivations of the editors because we don't have data on that. And as historians, we stick to data. We don't psychologize people. So we don't know actually what motivates them. And we didn't want to surmise because again, it was very important to us to just stick to the facts and the diffs as Wikipedians call it, which is displays of different versions of the same Wikipedia page. So we have hundreds of diffs that we cited in our article.
Oh, that's fascinating. You can actually track how it changes over time. That's really interesting. It's one of those questions that I think draws on almost broader trends in society, questions of almost epistemology of knowledge to some extent, because you have all of these, to the extent that Wikipedia is a social media company, right? You have all these social media companies like Facebook and Twitter, trying to deal with misinformation. And then you have the problem of who to outsource that to and sort of who the bottom line of misinformation is. And I can imagine Wikipedia, people who work for Wikipedia are also up against that same, epistemological paradox of, you can't just choose one person or a group of people and say, okay, yes, you are the final backdrop in whatever this is, be it, questions about, all the controversies that Twitter has had, right? Questions of election denial or questions of vaccines and all of the things. In your conversations with Wikipedia editors and people who work for the company, is it something that they try to actively do? Like, are there things that if I went onto a Wikipedia page and tried to edit, does that go through some rounds of people checking, or can it just sort of automatically get greenlit unless somebody later on challenges it?
That's a good question. Wikipedia has all sorts of policies and guidelines that editors are supposed to abide by. So if you just go in and let's say delete a whole page, right, that would be considered vandalism, and that would be reverted immediately, perhaps not even by a human editor, just by a bot that would recognize it as vandalism. If you were to just come in and like write a lie, then if it's a page that has enough followers and enough editors who are following it, then again that would be caught very quickly. But what ends up happening is that these particular pages that we looked at, these articles, didn't have a very big number of editors working on them. And those who had been advancing scholarship-based, evidence-driven data, right, that was in line with mainstream peer-reviewed scholarship, were really pushed out of this area. And those who were advancing a distorted narrative kind of gained the upper hand until by, I would say, early 2022, there was almost nobody left in this area except for this group of what we call distortionists. And I think that's Wikipedia's biggest weakness, is that when there's an area that has a relatively small number of really committed editors willing to sink in the time, then you might see disinformation on a disturbing scale. I did want to say that, yeah, I think Wikipedia has the reputation of being far more credible than Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, or right, any social media platform, and to some extent with good reason. I think overall there are probably many really good areas on Wikipedia that sort of get a lot of attention from editors and really being edited well. But at the same time, it's to quote a colleague of mine, it's not magical, right? It has some serious holes in its security system. And I think what we did in this article was to call attention to them. I don't think that the Wikimedia Foundation is ready to broach them yet. Their latest response to a media piece in the Orange County Register there was to say, editors are our first line of defense, and we're just going to trust, the system. But my response to that is, well, what's your second line of defense when that doesn't work, right? Because editors is where this started, and the kind of machinery in place to police editors' conduct, such as the arbitration committee, right, which is kind of it's been likened to Wikipedia's high court or a Supreme Court. That has not managed to contain this problem.
Interesting. Sure. And also, you can't expect whoever these people are in the Supreme Court of Wikipedia to be experts at everything, right? So yeah.
Right, exactly. I think a big problem is that they are not experts at least in history. That's very clear. And nor do they claim to be. And so I don't think it's their fault. I think it's the system. There's a systemic flaw over here where kind of the idea behind this is that the ARBCOM polices just editor conduct. And there are some areas where conduct overlap with content. So if you're bringing in bad sources, then that does count as a conduct violation. But because these ARBCOM members are not historians, they don't really know when a source is bad or not. So there's like a bit of a catch-22 over here, and that leads to a big hole in the security system and the seeping in of disinformation.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And as you note in your article, there's over 7 billion hits on Wikipedia every month. So that's about, on average for every human in the earth, living on Earth, there's one view of Wikipedia page a month. And just this very anecdotally, but all of the high schoolers, college students, even graduate students, I know, if they're starting to do research on something they don't know much about, Wikipedia is always the first page you go to. And everybody expects at least it to be mostly true or rooted in truth. And so obviously it's super problematic. Do you have any ideas of what a potential pathway towards a solution will be? I mean, I know it's sort of a lofty question because this is obviously much bigger than just the sort of narrow, fascinating case of Holocaust distortion on Wikipedia, right? If we can solve this problem, we've solved one of the biggest problems about internet misinformation. But what are some thoughts as somebody who's really been in this for the last 5 years?
Yeah, 2.5 years. But yeah, I mean, what I think that the Wikimedia Foundation needs to take more seriously this problem. And just by showing interest, even, I think that they can do a lot. So Croatian Wikipedia, because there are many different Wikipedias, right? We worked on the English one, but in Croatian Wikipedia, there was a real problem of bias and distortion. And it got to the Wikimedia Foundation, and they sponsored a report, or sort of investigation, like an independent investigation. And just by shining the light on this, it led to this massive changeover or turnover of administrators who are basically editors with more editing privileges, and it really helped clean up Croatian Wikipedia. So the problem is that in English Wikipedia, because there is this arbitration committee, the Wikimedia Foundation kind of takes a step back and says, let the community can handle it on its own. But I think that that we've shown that the community cannot handle it on its own. And even in the wake of our article, ArbCom opened a case on its own, which was an unprecedented step in itself. And for a second there, it seemed like they were going to do the right thing, but it just ended with, I mean, there were some positive steps that they took, but essentially they refrained from addressing the issue of source misrepresentation and use of unreliable sources, and they let one of the people who has authored really disturbing things just walk free. So, and plus they topic banned an editor who's done fantastic work. So they really messed that up, and that's why I think that the Wikimedia Foundation does need to step in. And they what it would look like exactly, I'm not sure, but I think it would be great if they could involve academia more, so that it is a grassroots project, and I think that is its superpower. That's amazing that Wikipedia is not beholden to the grip of academia. But in cases where there is proven distortion, I think that they do need to bring in expertise.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So we said before that your original research was in Italian Jewry, and everything from really modern Jewry through fascism. Do you view? I'm going to ask you some detailed questions about that in a second, because it's a fascinating era and geography of Jewish history. But do you see that research connected to your work on Wikipedia, or was Wikipedia sort of this interesting story that happened that then you sort of kept digging into?
Yeah, in a way, I would say like the second option. It just sort of, this came out of my teaching more than out of my research. I did come across, I did look at Wikipedia briefly when I was looking at Wikipedia's coverage of Italian Jewish history. I was curious how it was covered. But yeah, the two projects were pretty disconnected. I did speak with a reporter recently who observed that in my Italian Jewish project, I spoke about distorted memory of Italian Jews' experience, and then in this project, I speak about the distorted memory of Polish Jews. So I feel like there must be there is a connection there that I didn't even think of much. But yeah, I like to think that my Italian project was much bigger than just speaking about the distortion of memory. And in fact, in my Italian book, I look at how Jews distorted their own memory, or just in general the world's memory, I guess, of Italy's role in World War II. And also I just look at much larger questions like how Jews upheld fascism to a large extent, and questions of assimilation. So yeah, I like to think that it's much bigger than this Wikipedia project, and just touches on a whole range of themes that I don't in the case of Poland, and probably never will, because again, I'm not a Polish historian.
Sure. Yeah. And those points that you just brought up are fascinating. So I'm going to dig into that in a minute. I can imagine some listeners are a little surprised, excited, shocked, whatever adjective we want to use there, to hear the Jewish aiding of fascism or distortion of their own memory. Just to sort of, set the stage, right? Obviously, for European or Ashkenazi Jewry, one of the major inflection points, just for our listeners that might not be aware, and sort of their own history, was Emancipation. And that is when, at least officially, legally, right, starting in France and then, creeping to other European nation states, Jews were officially granted equality under the law. Obviously, systemic anti-Semitism, to a large extent, was still at play in a lot of places. If I'm remembering correctly, Italy was a little bit later. It wasn't until the mid-19th century that Jews were granted formal emancipation. So that gives it about 80 years, right, between emancipation and the official rise of fascism. You can probably correct me at the dates here. Maybe I'll get a B- if this was a final class. But I'm wondering if you could sort of set the stage, tell the story. What were Jews in Italy doing in the mid 1800s? What was life like? And then how did they react to the rise of fascism?
Yeah, that's a great question. Jews in Italy were a really tiny community. They still are, always have been. And so at their peak, they numbered about 45,000, and they made up less than a tenth of percent of the Italian population. And they lived mostly in places like Rome, and towns and cities north of Rome. In the mid 19th century, up until the mid 19th century, Jews in many parts of Italy were living in ghettos, which were walled neighborhoods. This has nothing to do with the ghettos of World War II, right? Which were basically instruments of mass death. But the ghettos in Italy were basically walled or gated neighborhoods that Jews could come could leave freely whenever they wanted to, but they had to be back by curfew time, and they couldn't live outside of the ghetto. And the ghettos were crowded places, and they came with restrictions like on who Jews could marry or what they could work in, or um, uh, and a good dose of anti-Semitism. And then in the mid 19th century, Italy kind of went or started the path of becoming a nation. And as a side effect of that process, and this is called the Risorgimento, as a side effect of that process, it also took on many liberties that had been missing in the age of absolutism. And so one of these liberties was religious equality. And Jews therefore gained this kind of civic equality. They became equal citizens instead of discriminated against subjects. And once they became citizens, you see a kind of rise of Italian Jewry, which also went hand in hand with Italy's industrialization, because in the late 19th century, Italy started to industrialize, and Jews just happened to be in a good place geographically for that. With the north of Italy industrialized at a faster pace, especially urban areas, and Jews again happened to live in the north and in urban areas. So they joined the middle class, and they kind of felt pretty much at home. And then in the lead up to World War I, Italy began to be polarized between left and right. And the left espoused socialism or communism or various forms of those movements. And a good number of socialists objected to Italy's joining World War I. Meanwhile, the middle class tended to be in favor of Italy's joining World War I. And Jews were definitely on that side of the equation. They saw World War I as an opportunity to sort of bring Italy glory and strengthen its might, et cetera, et cetera. After World War I, Italy became even more polarized, and this is the backdrop to the rise of fascism. So Italy had what was called the Red Biennium, or these 2 years of sort of hyper socialist communist activity. There were land grabs and massive strikes that would go on for weeks on end. And again, Italy was very much polarized between between the working class and the middle class. Working class tended to veer leftwards and to be in favor of this social turmoil, and the middle class tended to want to crack down on these strikes and demanding a stronger government that would put the working class in its place. And that is really where Mussolini comes into the picture. He promised the middle class law and order and discipline, and he kind of delivered. He quelled the strikes, and And Italian Jews supported Mussolini mostly because of that. It was mostly a class decision, or not quite decision, that's the wrong word, but it was mostly a class tendency, a class-driven tendency. Now, it's not that all Italian Jews were raging fascists, but only a very tiny minority of Italian Jews were anti-fascist, and the majority either sort of accepted Mussolini or actively supported him with various.
Is your sense on that just that this was at a time, when internally the Jewish question was sort of being floated around the Jewish community, and you have like a whole trend of Jews trying to do whatever they can to fit in with whatever nation state? Or was it more of a philosophical support of nationalism?
I think that's hard to tell. I mean, like I'm not sure how you would measure that in the primary sources. I'm trying to think of memoirs I've looked
This is why
at.
it's easier to not be a
Yeah.
historian, because I can just throw out theories and don't have to actually find documents.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I always try to stick to the sources and follow the data. So that is actually a good question, sort of. But I think from the sources that we do have, I think Italian Jews really breathed an audible sigh of relief when Mussolini came to power, because they felt so threatened by um this notion, or this the specter of a socialist upheaval that would do away with private capital. They just had too much to lose.
Well, that's fascinating. And so there was a Jewish support in the early, right, creeping towards, the mid 20th century. And then at what point, or if ever, did they sort of realize their mistake? Did that take until the rise of Hitler? What sort of happened in the late 20s, early 30s?
Um, I think I think the rise of Hitler didn't bring about a huge change for the Jews of Italy as far as their political leanings. If anything, I think they felt extremely relieved to be in Italy, which did not have sort of a racist, racist laws at the time. Um, and Mussolini, it should be said, was really inconsistent with his messaging on Jews. So one day he would give an interview saying that Italy loved its Jews and they were at home there, and then another day he would go on record saying something a lot less friendly. So so in hindsight, hindsight, you say, I hindsight is always 2020.
Mm-hmm.
In hindsight, you can see Mussolini's regime kind of creeping towards racism, and of course the height of that would be their takeover of Ethiopia in 1935, and the institution of racial laws over there, which would then find an echo in their anti-Jewish racial laws in Italy proper, in the peninsula itself. But Italian Jews did not see that. They did not draw those connections. And so, really, for them, the biggest change only comes in the summer and fall of 1938, when Italy, or fascist Italy, enacts a series of racial laws very similar to the Nuremberg laws, saying things like Jews can no longer marry non-Jews, they can no longer work in all sorts of professions, they can no longer own a business above a certain size, and then a whole plethora of regional and state restrictions. Anything from they couldn't advertise they couldn't advertise in the press, to they couldn't join sports clubs, to they couldn't go to the seaside. You name the restriction, it probably existed.
Mm-hmm. And at that point, was there sort of so we just to set the period here, we have from the rise of Hitler to 38, which is about 4 to 6 years. Italian Jews saw that Mussolini and Hitler were, allies, buddies, whatever term we want to use. They were still, because of, I guess, their own class or private interests, still internally supporting Mussolini. Also, I do believe this, I don't want to open up a whole other can of worms. I think Mussolini actually helped lay the foundations for what eventually became the Israeli Navy. I know that he was close with Jabotinsky, who was the founder of revisionist Zionism. I'm sure we can do a whole other podcast about that one day. So we'll put that aside. But internally, Italian Jews seem to be, riding the wave to some extent, not super concerned with what was happening in the rest of Europe. And then at a certain point, things crashed. And then what, right? What sort of happened, I guess,
Right.
during World War II, and
Yeah.
post World War II.
So what I found that was interesting, and I think this is a central part of my book, was that even when the racial laws hit, most Italian Jews didn't really understand that it was a truly Italian initiative and that this was Italy really and truly turning against them. And what we do see at that time is people saying, oh, yeah, Hitler forced Mussolini into this, or Hitler pressured him and he just didn't have a choice. And this really was, I think, the earliest manifestation of what would later become, and historians have called, the myth of the good Italian, which is a thing kind of in the scholarship where historians have looked at Italy's reputation and how it doesn't quite line up with its actions. And it's not particular to Jews. So some historians have looked at how Italy had this reputation of being a very kind occupier in the Balkans, but actually were actually had a fairly brutal regime there. Other historians have looked at how Italy has had a reputation of being a very kind colonizer in Libya, in Somalia, and Eritrea, and Ethiopia, but actually, again, led some fairly brutal campaigns over there, and just had a sort of white supremacist regime that discriminated against all natives. But so and in the Jewish area as well, historians before me showed that Italy had this reputation of being really good towards Jews, this almost like an oxymoron, like the Axis state that saved Jews. And there is a grain of truth in it. Italians did save Jews in some regions, particularly in the south of France and in the Balkans. But in Italy proper, in the peninsula itself, that wasn't the case at all. So anyway, there is this myth of the myth of the good Italian, and what my argument was that I think Jews were one of the earliest proponents of this myth by their disbelief that that it was actually Italy that was perpetuating this racist regime. As time went by, they kind of settled into this horrible reality.
Mm.
And in September of 1943, when the Germans entered the country, then they also had to view how Italian police were collaborating with German soldiers to deport Jews, to arrest them and to deport them. And so by this time, I don't know if they were thinking much about sort of their opinions of fascism. It was more about trying to survive. And then after World War II, I found they still went back to this very kind of what's the word I'm looking for? They still went back to a narrative that really was a flattering narrative towards Italy, kind of whitewashing Italy's role in the persecution of Jews. And I showed that happened for a whole spate of reasons. But yeah, that is one of the curiosities of Italian Jewish history, is
And
that
was that mostly Italian Jews that were still living in Italy, or even ones that had immigrated to America or Israel or other places that they were still viewing Italy like,
yeah, both. Yeah, I have a chapter on Italian Jews who go to the U.S. and one on Italian Jews who went to the British Mandate of Palestine. And particularly in the US, they join with Italian Americans, non-Jewish Italian Americans, in kind of just telling a really nice story about Italy and how there are different versions. In some versions, it's Mussolini was forced by Hitler. In other versions, it's, yeah, Mussolini was a really bad person, but the rank and file of Italians were forced by him. So there are different versions of this fairy tale. But Italian Jews were really part of sort of spreading these ideas.
That's fascinating. And just anecdotally, I mean, it totally doesn't jive with my experience of talking to Jews from other countries, both Ashkenazi and Mizrahi Jews, where usually, this is going to be a huge generalization, but generally the story that a lot of Jews that are no longer in their home countries, which, at this point is 99% of Jews, ones that have made it to the, to Israel-Palestine area and ones that have made it to America, is the story they like to tell about their great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents is not one of, whitewashing the history. It's one of, we had this happen to us and pogrom and anti-Semitism and this. So it is fascinating that it's different from the Italian Jewish experience. Well, I wanted to thank you for your time. I'm going to ask you in a second, if there's anything else about either components of your research that you want to share, but I really appreciate this. This was a fascinating conversation. I guess the last question that I'll ask you before throwing it to you and seeing if there's anything else you want to end with is, do you have any other upcoming research projects, or what's next?
Thanks for asking that. Yeah, I'm now working on, I guess there are two projects that interest me and very much aligned with the way you presented me as having these two competing interests. So one is in the digital humanities, following on my Wikipedia project. I'm started to take interest in the Hebrew Wikipedia and on in distortions that are going on there. And boy, are there distortions there. It's just like kind of stunning what's happening over there. So I'm hoping that that'll be my next research project. It's going to take a while before that I sort of really figure out who's who and exactly what is going on there. But it's I can already see that it's pretty disturbing. So I'm looking forward to shedding light on that. And then my other more long-term project is again on Italian Jewish history, and I'm looking at it's this I hope will be my second book, looking at Italian Jewish involvement in Italy's African colonies. So I'm looking at Italian Jews who either went to or were in touch with Libya, Ethiopia, Somalia, Eritrea, which raises a whole kind of a whole new dynamics, or new for me, sorry, looking at intra-Jewish racism and relationships between Italian Jews and Jews of color, between Italian Jews as kind of representatives of a colonizer nation, and then sort of indigenous Jews, and looking at the relationships between them. So I'm really looking forward to that topic, which is I guess within Italian Jewish history, but also venturing into Jews and colonialism, and and the history of Jews of color. So we'll see where that takes me.
Well, that sounds fascinating, and we'll have to do another podcast episode after that book comes out. Dr. Shira Klein, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Daniel, for having me.